It appears our other panelist is not here today, so I'd just like to introduce Dr. Siphokazi Magadla, who teaches in the Department of Politics and International Relations, feminist extraordinaire. She's one of our leading scholars here at Rhodes University, or at the university currently known as Rhodes. And so I'll just hand over to her to give us a paper.
Thank you so much, Tando. I'm happy to be part of this conference. And I'm presenting on behalf of myself and my co-author, Nica Cornell. This paper is part of a working chapter for, hopefully, it will make it to the next issue of the South African Foreign Policy Review. So sometime in the past year, I was invited to contribute a chapter for the next issue. And I said to the editors that ever since I started teaching on foreign policy, I've been looking for a paper that tells us what it has meant for South Africa to have two women as the ministers of foreign affairs. Somehow that paper, I did not manage to find that paper. And the fact that the editors agreed for us to continue to work on this paper tells us that they too had not found a paper that tells us what it has meant to have previously Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma and then currently Maite Nkoana-Mashabane as the foreign affairs ministers in the past 18 years. And so, yes. So what I'm going to do is to do the introduction, to read the conceptual framework, and I'm going to then go into the analysis of, so basically, what does it mean, if it means anything, to have had two women foreign ministers for feminists in international relations? So to begin, we argue that South Africa's foreign policy, 23 years into democracy, has been conceptually and empirically ambitious and eventful for scholars in international relations. The government under the African National Congress has made substantial leaps in crafting a foreign policy agenda that has championed peaceful resolution of conflict, multilateralism, democracy, and human rights in ways that are distinctly different from the militarized and overbearing order of its apartheid predecessor, whose dominance resulted in enormous destruction in the Southern African region that left, and I'm quoting Mandela, that left 2 million dead and inflicted an estimated $62.45 billion of damage on the economies of its neighbors. As Spence argues, South Africa has invested material and ideological resources to reconfigure its foreign policy identity as a conflict resolver, mediator, standard bearer for the poor and dispossessed in international society, defender of human rights, and a regional leader. Among the shifts in this foreign policy framework is the ANC's attention to the participation of women in its foreign policy. Since 1999, when Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma was appointed as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, women have been at the helm of the country's foreign policy leadership. Dlamini-Zuma served as a foreign minister from 1999 until 2009, and Maite Nkoana-Mashabane from 2009 until present. It is unusual, even in older democracies, that 18 years of the country's foreign policy agenda has been developed with two women as ministers. This is because foreign policy in IR continues to be understood to be a male domain where governments look like men's clubs, as Cynthia Enlow has argued, in which women appear as subjects acted upon by events of international life. It is thus surprising that little academic attention has been given to the legacies of Dlamini-Zuma and Nkoana-Mashabane, the women who have led South African foreign policy for almost 2 decades. Dlamini-Zuma, with the support of Nkoana-Mashabane, made history when she became the first woman to chair the African Union. If current political speculation is anything to go by, Dlamini-Zuma may possibly make history again if she attains the presidency of the ANC in December 2017, and possibly the presidency of the country in 2019. Dlamini-Zuma and Nkoana-Mashabane form an elite group of women who have been foreign ministers, as in 2013, out of 193 members of the United Nations, only 18 were led by women, and only 23 had female foreign ministers. Easy, good. Continue. Okay. In 2017, the number has risen. The number has risen to 27 female foreign ministers globally, including countries that are not members of the UN.
Carry on.
Feminists in IR have argued that the discipline is defined by conceptual and physical categories of the internal or domestic and the external or international. These categories are predicated on a gender division where women are assumed to reside in the domestic national sphere while men make decisions about the protection of the sovereignty of the state and of the women inside states from outsiders. This division then structures the possibilities and constraints of the achievement of peace and security within an international structure that is assumed to be unpredictable and anarchic. It is therefore becomes important to examine, as this paper does, the domestic and international conditions that have made it possible for women to be considered suitable appointments to make decisions about South Africa's international approach. So this paper then examines the legacies of Mashabane in order to suggest implications of their tenures for feminist IR theory and practice, as well as future South African foreign policy. So to begin the conceptual framework, we argue that feminist critiques of dominant IR theory argue that many concepts central to international relations theory and practice, such as power, sovereignty, and security, have been framed in terms that we associate with masculinity. Since its inception following World War I, the discipline of IR has been preoccupied with questions of war and peace. This led the discipline largely to a discipline largely reduced to a disproportionate focus on relations between states as the core unit of analysis. As argued by Christine Sylvester, some say the IR field has no stories to tell about people at all, telling only abstract balances of power, national interest, regimes, trade flows, and the like. When peopling IR, as Petman argues, telling stories of the personalities of or individuals who have shaped the behavior of states in IR, it becomes clear that it is men who continue to dominate the running of states and the framing of the conduct of its foreign policy. Schaubeck argues that anarchy, which is presented as providing the distinction between the domestic and the external, can also be understood as demarcating the private and the public. The boundary between a public-domestic place protected, at least theoretically, by the rule of law and the private space of the family, where in many cases no such legal protection exists. As Schaubeck importantly notes, feminists in IR have consistently argued that both women's lives are not just lived in global politics, but of global politics, and that the discrimination of women, discrimination women experience is interlinked with the existence and causes of structural and physical violence in the international arena. Particularly, feminists have argued that patriarchal social organization in global politics is a principal cause not only of women's subordination, but also of empire building and globalization, among other international processes. Feminists in the discipline have argued that in order to make sense of the invisibility of both women in international relations theory and practice, it is important to examine how concepts of femininity and masculinity shape ideas about who can travel across states. It becomes important to see who is representing their countries offshore and how those ideas determine who is seen as a legitimate participant in everyday international relations events. This is because feminists have continued to argue that IR is encoded in masculine territory because the soldier, the citizen, the political subject, and the state are gendered male. Tigner argues that it was not a mistake that feminist critiques entered IR theory in the 1980s, just as the Cold War was coming to an end. She argues that the end of the contestation between the Soviet Union and the United States allowed for other issues to take center stage in international life, and therefore allowed for the consideration of other actors beyond the maneuvers of states, of powerful states. Hendricks points out that feminist theory and other theories such as social constructivism previously marginalized in IR were able to challenge dominant IR theories such as political realism because of their failure to predict the end of the Cold War, which ended the relative peace of a bipolar world. More importantly, realism, the dominant IR theory of the post-World War II and Cold War era, was fast becoming irrelevant in explaining the apparent shift from interstate war to intrastate conflicts. Here I'm quoting Cheryl Hendricks. The late 1980s and 1990s in Africa and the former Soviet Union and the former Soviet states in Eastern Europe, such as the former Yugoslavia, plunged into intrastate wars that are noted to last twice as long as interstate wars. As Paul Williams argues, in the 1990s, Africa suffered from a rise in the number of armed conflicts, as other parts of the world were experiencing a significant reduction, and thus by the start of the 21st century, more people were being killed in African wars than in the rest of the world combined. In fact, it is said that the average number of armed conflicts in Africa starting each year during the 1990s was twice that of the previous decade. Women's involvement in wars of national liberation and post-colonial wars in Africa, Latin America, and Asia propelled the discussion of women's access and leadership in areas of national security. These intrastate wars showed that gender needed to be taken seriously in the democratic transition of post-conflict states so as to facilitate the democratic control of the security apparatus and to facilitate women's entry into positions of leadership in all areas of state governance, including those of security. Evidence from wars in countries such as Liberia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Sierra Leone, and the genocide in Rwanda, among others, showed the importance of women's access to sectors such as the military and foreign policy in order to shape the direction of state resources and hopefully to curtail a military-centric foreign policy posture. The unanimous adoption of UN Resolution 1325 in the year 2000 is seen as a significant triumph in the articulation of the call by feminists for women's participation in bodies such as the UN, regional bodies, and at the national level. As Carol Korn notes, UN 1325 not only recognizes that women have been active in peace building and conflict prevention, it also recognizes women's right to participate as decision makers at all levels of conflict prevention, conflict resolution, and peace building processes. Africa and Latin America constitute the majority of countries where women's representation in parliament, for example, is more than 40%, with Rwanda leading globally with 63.8%, and followed by Bolivia at 53%, as well as the impressive representation of women in parliament in other countries such as Nicaragua, Senegal, Mexico, and South Africa being in the 9th position globally in terms of women's representation. The point being that these numbers come from the global south. Iceland and Sweden are the only two countries outside of these two regions where women's representation is above 40%. It is also in Africa and Latin America where women have mostly been appointed as foreign ministers. Out of the list of 27 female foreign ministers, 9 are from Africa and 4 from Latin America. Thus, Africa constitutes the highest number of female foreign ministers in the world. Some of these come from Rwanda, Ghana, Namibia, Kenya, Madagascar, and I mentioned Liberia. As well, it is worth noting that since Ellen Johnson Sirleaf became Liberia's president in 2009, all of the 3 ministers who served in the foreign affairs have been women. Sure. It seems that countries, this is the argument that we are making, that it seems that countries that have transitioned from war in the recent years are more likely to appoint women as foreign ministers. Whilst in the older democracies, such as those in Europe that are assumed to be more democratic and therefore more encouraging of women's participation in political life, women's representation remains low, especially women's participation in foreign policy. Feminists have noted the further effect of such low representation of women in foreign policy. For example, the constitution of the EU Council, which depends on the ministerial appointments within member states, the key ministries, Prime Minister, Foreign and Finance Ministers continue to be very male-dominated in the 27 member states of the EU. Even among the EU states, it continues to be the norm that women are appointed to domestic ministerial positions such as those of education and health, leading to a low representation of women in the EU as the body. In particular, in structures such as the EU Council and the Council of the the Council of the European Union. Thus, in the main, women's leadership in sectors such as foreign policy, which deal with questions of security, continues to be an anomaly. Even though Africa leads globally in the number of women appointed as foreign ministers, it is important to note that this is 9 women out of 54 in the continent. Furthermore, when women do enter these spaces, there seems to be a different set of expectations of their leadership compared to their male counterparts. For instance, while acknowledging the significance of the adoption and the implementation of UN 1325, Carol Korn warns that 1325 poses the danger of essentializing women as intrinsically more peaceful than men. The resolution's emphasis on women as peacemakers who have special insights into the achievement of peace and security because they are presumed to desire peace and security more due to the costs of instability to their livelihoods poses this risk. Whether women are peacemakers, heads of state, or ministers of foreign policy, there seems to be social expectations that their forms of leadership will be substantially different from those of their male counterparts, even though these women often come from the same political cultures as the men. And here I cite also an article I wrote with Magadla and Makunga. But Korn also argues that feminist theorists and researchers have exhaustively catalogued the dangers of these kinds of constructs for women. They erase differences among and between women. Gender appears as though it were a separable identity from race, class, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, and a set of meanings not entwined with other structures of power. Gender appears as a fixed identity instead of a process, a doing, a making. Resting our claim of legitimacy as a political actor on a construct of who we are and what we can do for you, rather than on a claim of rights, means that we can easily be excluded again when we fail to embody and enact the construct. The construct of difference that we argue makes us fit to participate can be turned into an argument for why it would be dangerous to allow us to participate. Making sense of Korn's argument, we argue that the early reviews of even Dlamini-Zuma's legacy at the AU, which largely point to a general disappointment of her achievements during her tenure as the first woman chairperson, used gender as a tool to analyze the shortcomings of her administration. Allison notes that some in the AU have expressed that not another woman should be the next chairperson of the AU. And indeed, this wish was fulfilled when Musa Faki Mohammed was elected as the current chairperson of the AU. In this regard, Dlamini-Zuma's perceived shortcomings as a leader are read as reflective of women's leadership in general. Furthermore, while women in leadership have to reconcile with socially constructed assumptions about their leadership, the literature on women who have accessed positions as heads of states, military, and foreign affairs shows that there is a kind of woman who is able to attain this position, often because they do not display characteristics that are normatively associated with femininity. The discourse on the Iron Lady shows that while the discourse on women's participation in peace and security is legitimated through focusing on women's unique capacity to be peaceful mediators, the women who are likely to succeed in foreign policy or security in this area are those who display characteristics that are associated with male leadership. So we unpack this discourse around iron ladies of foreign policy. So for instance, Cynthia Enlow argues that everyday international relations events between states and their representatives is the work of men. Enlow points out that one of the most useful functions of Margaret Thatcher has served is to break through our numbness. When Margaret Thatcher stood in Venice with Francois Mitterrand, Yoshihiro Nakasone, Ronald Reagan, and other heads of state, we suddenly noticed that everyone else was male. One woman in a photo makes it hard to ignore that the men are men. However, when a woman is let in by men who control the political elite, it usually is precisely because that woman has learned lessons of masculinized political behavior well enough not to threaten male political privilege. The image that Enlow evokes is similar to the group images taken at AU summits of the heads of states. Out of 54 member states, Liberia's President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf stands as the only woman out of 54 men. The G7 meeting of the G7 states, for instance, that happened in Italy in May, was the first time that the German Chancellor Angela Merkel is pictured with another woman leader of the G7 states, Theresa May of UK. As Schauberg rightly points out, while women remain underrepresented in actual leadership, both females and femininity remain neglected in our concepts of leadership and scholarship which examines it. What happens is that women leaders are measured in terms of their ability to either live up to tropes of femininity, such as weakness, sympathy, marginality, dependence, and emotion and passivity, or masculine tropes of strength, objectivity, power, autonomy, independence, rationality, and aggressiveness. Margaret Thatcher was known as the Iron Lady for possessing characteristics of leadership that are associated with masculinity. The former Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir was the first woman leader to be termed an Iron Lady for similar reasons, as she was proudly called the best man in government by the predecessor David Ben-Gurion. This description of Iron Lady seems to continue to define the leadership qualities of women dealing in international relations. So the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who also was the Finance Minister in Nigeria, was also termed as the Iron Lady. And even the way she defined herself, she was also defined as a trouble woman. So in an interview to The Guardian, she described herself as, she said, "I'm a fighter, I'm very focused on what I'm doing, and relentless in what I want to achieve, almost to a fault. If you get in my way, you get kicked." Similar, the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Somalia, Minister Yusuf Haji Adan, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2012 to 2014, was also dubbed an Iron Lady for her strong will. These social expectations about leadership and particular pressures that are dependent on the field in which women are also shape whether women leaders raise questions of women's representation in their fields and the ways in which they either speak of women in particular or gender more generally. As Enlow states, when it comes to matters in IR, the woman who is likely to access that space is a woman who is seen to perform a leadership style that is associated with masculinity. Mampela Rampele describes such women as honorary men. Such women are then usually not able to perform a different type of leadership which departs from the masculine political culture. In her article about the manipulation of feminism by the post-9/11 Bush administration to legitimize the invasion of Afghanistan, to allegedly protect and liberate Afghan women from the Taliban, Ferguson notes the silence of Condoleezza Rice. Rice was the Bush administration's national security advisor from 2001 to 2005 and the Secretary of State from 2005 to 2009. Ferguson notes that as a woman in charge of national security, we might suppose her to be an obvious choice to be the spokesperson for the Bush administration rhetoric. But Rice was never the one who introduced any new policies or initiatives on women. Rather, it was First Lady Laura Bush who is the woman who most frequently represented the administration on women or on women's issues. We also, in observing Rice's own writing, we argue that her articulation of national interest in US foreign policy promotes the tenets of political realism that will ensure that the US maintains its place as the military supreme power for its self-defense interests. We argue that Rice speaks of ungendered citizens in her writing, with little mention of women's place or gendered realities in her conception of US foreign policy interest. Schoberg argues that feminist leadership in IR should embrace a post-hegemonic international relations that seeks to transform and do away with current power hierarchies in IR. Hudson argues that a feminist redefinition of power in relational terms, where the survival of one depends on the well-being of the other, would not only enhance women's security, but also that of men who are similarly threatened by the conventional gendered approach to security. Elsewhere, Hudson also argues that, has argued often that this kind of transformative leadership that she advocates for a feminist leadership in security is not possible in institutions because the inclusion of women is not accompanied with a commitment to broader institutional transformation. Hudson has argued that the gender mainstreaming process has resulted in an add women and stay approach that often results in women assimilating to these elite and often patriarchal cultures of the institutions that they seek to transform. It is therefore in this regard that the assessment of the legacies of Dlamini-Zuma and Nkoana-Mashabane are important, and as far as they make it possible to examine their priorities as leaders and what their legacies mean for feminist IR. So we do a short biography, for instance, of Dlamini-Zuma and how, as a student leader, she was active in SASO. She was the vice president of SASO by the time she escaped to exile in 1976, and how she met Thabo Mbeki in Swaziland in 1975 and was encouraged to recruit more members to join the ANC, and how then she finishes she finishes her degree in Bristol and continues to work for the ANC in exile. And the point we try to make with her history is to argue that her own ideas around African Renaissance can really be traced as far back as her role in the student movement as a black consciousness leader. So I want to skip to the biography part and to the point where, as a Minister of Foreign Affairs, she was often described as the nuts and bolts woman, as well as why, in a sense, it made sense for her to be the foreign minister under the Mbeki administration to carry out this idea of an African Renaissance project. So we argue that being recruited by Mbeki in Swaziland proved to be the beginning of a long relationship of shared ideas between Dlamini-Zuma and Mbeki. This was then reflected in the articulation of the African Renaissance project that framed South Africa's foreign policy under Mbeki's presidency. In August 1998, Thabo Mbeki, already president of the ANC, officially launched his African Renaissance on national television, stating that the beginning of our rebirth as a continent must be our own rediscovery of our soul, a journey of self-discovery and the restoration of our self-esteem. As Khafise states, this clarion call could have been lifted directly out of the SASO policy manifestos that Dlamini was a part of. Dlamini-Zuma's political home when she entered politics, which declared that the black man must build up his own value system and see himself as defined and not defined by others. Both Mbeki and Dlamini-Zuma recognized that for South Africa and Africa to succeed, the international structure must change if new norms are to have a chance of being successfully implemented. In this frame, Dlamini-Zuma considered one of her main priorities as to challenge the rich countries and institutions of the world and to say that it is unacceptable for one part of the world to be so rich and for the other to be dying of hunger. These are the words of Dlamini-Zuma. She was elected president of the United Nations 2001 World Conference on Racism which was held in Durban and played a central role in drafting its final declaration. One can hear the echoes of young Dlamini-Zuma, who said that the white man is not your problem as such, your problem is capitalism and imperialism. During her time, the African Renaissance reshaped continental institutions, with South Africa hosting and taking lead at the Durban Summit, at which the AU was founded in July 2002. The no-nonsense, business-like and tough manner with which she chaired and conducted deliberations at the AU ministerial session is still referred to with admiration by many diplomats across the continent. Despite being described as the nuts and bolts woman, the one who got the paperwork signed, sealed, and delivered behind the scenes, here we are quoting Justice Malala, in the articulation of African Renaissance, it is clear from Dlamini-Zuma's history in the Black consciousness movement that the project of Africa's revival was in line with the principles she has believed in since before joining the ANC. It was also during her tenure that South Africa demonstrated its commitment to a peaceful Africa by sending peacekeepers to Burundi, DRC, and Sudan, and leading the peace processes in DRC, Ivory Coast, Sudan, and Zimbabwe. Mbeki and Dlamini-Zuma understood that if South Africa was to be taken seriously in its commitment to the realization of African Renaissance, these aspirations needed to be accompanied by material commitments to ending political instability and wars on the continent. Within feminist and activist circles in South Africa, within feminist and activist circles in the Southern African Development Community, SADC, Dlamini-Zuma is lauded for her leadership in the adoption of the regional body's Protocol on Gender and Development in Johannesburg in 17 August 2008. An often cited anecdote in feminist circles is that Dlamini-Zuma assured feminists that the protocol was going to be signed at the end of the summit, whether the men liked it or not. Giving a keynote address at the launch of the Gender-Linked SADC Protocol in 2010, Dlamini-Zuma noted that in SADC we are still faced with a situation where in some countries women have minority status, they are not allowed to own property, are not entitled to inherit the estates of those who are deceased, experience a gender division of labor, and endure a dominant patriarchal value system. This protocol has elevated the SADC Declaration on Gender and Development to the most binding of its instruments, since it is legally binding, compelling member states to expedite efforts towards gender equity in the region. It further calls for far-reaching changes and includes timelines for these goals, amongst which is the inclusion of gender equality and equity in national constitutions, the repeal of all discriminatory laws, and work towards the continental goal of 50% women in political decision-making positions by 2015. As she noted, the SADC Protocol on Gender and Development is a global first, having set 28 substantive targets for achieving gender equality by 2015 on constitutional legal rights, government, education and training, productive resources and employment, economic empowerment, gender-based violence, health, HIV and AIDS, peace building and conflict resolution, media and information communication. The non-governmental organization Gender Links, in collaboration with researchers and activists across Southern Africa, has been monitoring the implementation of the SADC Protocol with an annual regional barometer and country barometers that track how SADC member states are implementing the targets of the protocol. The 2016 barometer showed that SADC had only achieved about 2/3 of what it had set out in the protocol, and states that that implementation remains the key challenge. The report includes a gender attitude survey, which shows that one of the greatest challenges for the region is to challenge the patriarchal attitudes that constantly undermine the quest for gender equality. One of the key criticisms of Dlamini-Zuma's time as a foreign minister is her silence on the political violence in Zimbabwe. Her suggestion at the time was that the South African media was exaggerating the levels of crisis in Zimbabwe and had failed to paint a balanced picture of events both in Zimbabwe and South Africa. Boyson argues that Dlamini-Zuma did not oppose Mbeki when his quiet diplomacy ruled the roost in relations with Zimbabwe. Together they turned a blind eye to torture, vote rigging, and human rights abuses in the name of continental brotherhood. In the main, it can be argued that Dlamini-Zuma was part of a defining and ambitious time in South Africa's foreign policy, this we argue. Her long political history of a commitment to a new liberatory African future prepared her for her big ideas and the concrete nuts and bolts that were instrumental in selling the idea of African Renaissance and the programs that were to form part of its realization. While within SADC, she left an instrument for gender and development that has made it possible for feminists to diligently monitor the actions of their governments. It is no wonder then that even as she has concluded her tenure as the AU chairperson, her legacy is simultaneously grounded in ambitious vision and the concrete. She has left the continent with a vision for its future in the articulation of Agenda 2063 that she has championed, a document which bears the stamp of her ideological preoccupations from gender rights to Pan-Africanism to the unflinching emphasis on continental integration. Some of her achievements is around cleaning up AU bureaucracy, for example, where even some observers have argued that Dlamini-Zuma has brought a balance of accountability and transparency to AU processes.
Yeah. I'm going to ask, there is a second paper, right?
No, the person is not there.
The person's not here.
So.
Oh, I'm not okay,
but I will be concluding. Okay, so I'm going to skip some parts. So just to conclude on the section on Dlamini-Zuma, we argue that, we note that Dlamini-Zuma has been described as many things, mainly intelligent, assertive, controlling, and taking no prisoners. Characteristics of many strong leaders. Yet she has also been described as incommunicative and not people-friendly. As William Gumede argues, though her domestic reputation is that of being abrasive, she has forced the respect of her counterparts throughout Africa, where foreign policy is the traditional terrain of some of the continent's hardest men. Dlamini-Zuma is nothing if not tough. This is Gumede's observation. Like women leaders elsewhere, she has not escaped the description of the Iron Lady. And it's difficult to imagine, we argue, that the interpretation of her leadership as abrasive and unfriendly would occur were she a man, if that language would be used. Mm-hmm. Can it be argued that Dlamini-Zuma has gained political respectability as a leader in part because her style of leadership resembles one that is associated with masculinity? This is the question we're asking ourselves. Can it be argued that part of her policy success in asserting agenda in South Africa, SADC, and the AU is because she has used these socially constructed characteristics of leadership towards the end of a feminist agenda? So in a sense, she has subverted the masculine traits towards a feminist agenda. It's a question. This is what we're asking ourselves. What does this mean for the type of woman who is likely to occupy the kind of leadership position that she has occupied? So must every other woman then do the same thing? So all of these questions, all these are questions that Dlamini-Zuma Dlamini-Zuma's complicated legacy raises for feminist IR. So when we come to Maite Nkoana-Mashabane, we do a brief biography of her. She was born in Limpopo, and her activism in the UDF, United Democratic Fund, her role as the High Commissioner of South Africa and Malaysia. But Maite Nkoana-Mashabane gets appointed in 2009 by Jacob Zuma at a time where the name of the department itself is changed. So it's no longer the Department of Foreign Affairs, but it becomes the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, sort of signaling a move, a change in South African foreign policy. And so, in a sense, grappling with her legacies, also grappling with a new orientation of South Africa's foreign policy. So the Zuma administration comes, so we argue that the Zuma administration comes into power during the aftermath of the global financial crisis of 2008, which has signaled a fundamental shift in global power politics, in particular that of US power and the power of the West in general. That the power of the West in general is in decline. This is while the power of several countries in the global south, such as China, India, and Brazil, are on the rise. In Africa, for instance, there are also several countries that are understood to be part of the to be part of Africa's rise, such as Ethiopia, Mozambique, Tanzania, Ghana, and Nigeria. In this frame, Nkoana-Mashabane enters foreign policy in a changing world that has reconfigured old understandings and alliances. At this time, South Africa was also experiencing domestic instability, evidenced by growing unemployment and widening social inequalities. Thabo Mbeki's administration was criticized for its focus on the African integration program that others perceived to have come at a national cost of meaningfully addressing South Africa's inherited structural inequality. Perhaps it is no wonder then that Nkoana-Mashabane's main focus as minister has been in the area of economic diplomacy, based on the advancement of our domestic priorities at an international level. This is a quote from Mashabane. In 2011, for instance, the Ministry of Deco adopted a new white paper titled Building a Better World, the Diplomacy of Ubuntu, which was to signal the priorities of the new administration. Although the paper proposes to transform the domestic values of codependence, Ubuntu, to the international level, in policy terms, the paper continues the framework developed under Dlamini-Zuma's tenure that prioritizes the African agenda, South-to-South cooperation, multilateralism, and the South African model of negotiated settlements. Mzukisi Qobo has criticized the new framework, claiming that one fundamental shortcoming of the new white paper on foreign policy is an absence of a clear sense of leadership and purpose about the country's place in Africa and the world. He argues that the white paper misses a reconceptualization of multilateralism in a world that is no longer pivoted by unipolar arrangement, but rather characterized by multipolarity, in that Deco leadership seem to believe, rather wrongly, that the world is formatted along the old structures of North and South, rather than in a more diffuse manner, with a great deal of shared interests across divides, because it treats Africa and the world as if they've been on a standstill since the 1990s in its policy, its policy ideas remain frozen in time. This is Qobo's observation. Furthermore, Chris Landsberg has been critical of the adoption of the language of national interest, which is closely associated with the overbearing realist or power politics school and its preoccupation with power maximization. Nkoana-Mashabane has maintained that Deco, unlike realists, do not believe that the international system is characterized by anarchy and that states have to hide behind the cover of their sovereignty and focus narrowly on the pursuit of their national interests. Landsberg argues that in practice, Pretoria has found this easier said than done and has resorted to simply declaratory statements of intent than foreign policy. That foreign policy will come to serve the national interest. Yet in practice, we argue that Mashabane has been active in ensuring that South Africa gets admitted into the BRICS arrangement, and indeed that this was achieved under her leadership, that South Africa becomes a member of BRICS in 2011. Nkoana-Mashabane's explanation for the significance of South Africa's inclusion into BRICS demonstrates her awareness of the changing global political economy of which South Africa was to be an active part of. She argues that for us to do things, we need to ensure that we are not left behind. When we saw that there were shifts in global economic and political terms, that there was an intent to form what other people call mini-laterals, we thought we should stand and be counted and be at the forefront of the formation of the mini-laterals. They should serve the interests of the developing world, and now that these minilateralists have emerged as emerging powers, we stand counted among those. We are in the G20 and we formed the IPSA, India, Brazil and South Africa dialogue. When BRIC without an S was started, we were not shy. We kept knocking at their door to emphasize that this is not complete without us. She further notes that BRICS has a transformative agenda because although it is pro-South and not anti-North, it is pro-South, not anti-North. It is about changing the prevalent global order, political and in economic terms. This goal of changing the existing order is also demonstrated in her repeated calls for the reform of the United Nations Security Council, which remains undemocratic, unrepresentative, and unfair to the developing nations of small states, for example. And we also note her calls for challenging the impartiality of the IAC, for instance, questioning whether some permanent members of the Security Council use their power of veto to protect themselves and their allies from the ICC, while Africans, while the ICC has been overzealous in Africa. This is her own reading. So we argue that these are long-standing structural flaws which have been criticized by South Africa as far back as 2010. However, they were brought to a head in 2015 when the Sudanese president came to South Africa and South Africa failed to arrest the former president of Sudan. So we note that South Africa, sorry, I'm trying to rush, I'm almost done. Okay, so the relationship of African states with the ICC, of course, was cited by the South Africans as one of their main reasons that they wanted to withdraw from the ICC. But of course, it quite clearly challenges South Africa's own history and commitment to human rights, avoiding human rights violations, and the fact that it is an ICC founding state. And then we note in terms of Nkoana-Mashabane's record of raising questions around women or gender more broadly, that although Mashabane has a record of promoting women's empowerment in her history in the ANC Women's League, she has largely been silent on women's roles in her capacity as minister. The most visible expression of women's leadership in international institutions was her support of Dlamini-Zuma for the AU chairperson, to be the AU chair. Okay, so just to conclude, we argue that the legacy of Mashabane seems to really focus on these questions of economic diplomacy. This emphasis occurring at the time that the country seems to be shifting away from its commitment to human rights, And one of the achievements of the Rome Statutes for feminists was the recognition of rape as a weapon of war. South Africa's withdrawal from the ICC throws into question the country's commitment to gendered war crimes. The recent behavior at the UN also puts into question the country's credibility as an upholder of a particular kind of moral leadership in international relations. So we ask, what does it mean then for South Africa to invoke the concept of national interest under Mashabane that is associated with the realpolitik behavior at the time that the country seems to be undoing its human rights orientated principles that have been foundational to its foreign policy? So we argue that while Nkoana-Mashabane is clearly a keen observer of the rapid changes in the international political economy, it seems to us that much of her leadership has been reactionary to these shifts instead of providing bold and visionary leadership that makes it possible to envision a transformed international environment. So to conclude, in a sense, we have argued that the appointment of these two women is a rare occurrence in IR. We have argued that these two women, like all leaders, have complicated legacies. Dlamini-Zuma can be said to have pursued both an Africanist and feminist agenda in her tenure, which has shaped the policy framework of the organizations that she has participated in, locally, regionally, and continentally. She commands a respectability that is not often afforded to women leaders, we argue. Her achievements still leave unanswered the question of whether a different kind of woman leader, one without characteristics that are associated with masculinity, would be able to navigate and succeed in the institutions in which Dlamini-Zuma has. we hopefully have also shown that Nkoana-Mashabane has adapted to the shifting power politics in the international political economy. She has attempted to get, in a sense, the best deal for South Africa's national interests, as reflected in the critiques of the white paper on Ubuntu diplomacy and the adoption of the concept of national interest as a guiding principle for SA foreign policy practice. The administration of Nkoana-Mashabane has not been successful in articulating its agenda in ways that are clear. This conceptual ambiguity has contributed to confusion and concern about the direction of the country's foreign policy because of these recent actions that divorce it from its records of a human rights-orientated foreign policy. I stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Siphokazi. And I want to apologize for being late. It was entirely Professor Paula's fault because she ran over time with the previous session and she said blithely, "Oh, they can't start without you." Thank you, Tando, for taking in. Clearly, you know, you young people don't need me at all. But I'll sit here and pretend to chair the session. Thank you for an extraordinarily rich and informative paper. I shall abuse my privilege as chair just simply by bragging to say I've had the honor not only to meet but to do some work with these women when I was Commissioner for Gender Equality. So you may touch me. but I guess also because being at the CG, my job was to monitor them, and that gives you a very interesting insight into what they actually do. So I'm going to have some questions for you later on. But right now I invite the audience to questions, comments. 1, 2, okay. 3.
So Siphokazi, in your paper, you quoted, I don't remember if it was you or someone else was talking about institutions and how, in as far as they integrate women, the problem is that they integrate them into cultures that are not reformed or transformed cultures. They're predominantly masculine, Western masculine, however you imagine masculinity. So I suppose because also in the debate we're having in the other session on labor and institution, it was around issues of how institutions can transform to achieve either gender equality, transformation, or just justice. So I was just wondering if maybe we could engage you in that sort of debate of how institutions can transform to integrate women more meaningfully.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it and I think you're doing very great work. What do you think of Dr. Joyce Mujulu, former Vice President of Zimbabwe, and what do you think of Tuli Madonsela, the two leaders?
Betty, you're going to give us an easy question.
The paper had a wide overview, which was very helpful. I just felt at the end, because at the moment, that's what we're grappling with. She's an African woman who's had an amazing role in the liberation struggle. She's an outstanding woman. It's just the last few months that has raised so many questions. It's different from what your analysis is about the style of her feminism, which is an important aspect of critique of her. But it's just the silence that she, reflects with the current upheaval in South Africa, given where she's come from and given her own credentials.
Okay.
Do you want to do 3 and then I'll take another round?
Okay. Thank you so much. So the first question,
and it is a feminist question, in the sense that how are women used and co-opted, and how are powerful women used and co-opted, and we accept her as a powerful woman. How are women like that used? And It's a difficult choice, but anyway.
It's tough. And then there are marriages involved, all of those things.
And how to separate that.
Exactly. So I'm thinking, because the person who asked this question has just stepped out, maybe let me start with Tsitsi's question and Betty's questions. I mean, with regards to Majuru, so I am currently supervising a master's student who's doing a thesis on Joyce Majuru and women's political actions in Zimbabwe after independence. So in Zimbabwe, unlike South Africa, there's a lot of literature about what women did during liberation, which also actually critiques the idea that women were not part of the guerrilla war, But somehow what I have been missing, and maybe it's my own failure in terms of looking for that literature, is getting a sense of what has happened to women in Zimbabwean political parties after independence. So there's actually quite a lot of literature on the ANC Women's League, for example, and in a sense, its demise. People like Sherim Hasim, Rhodes, Lindiwe Makunga's PhD on ANC women in parliament, which really is contributes to that literature, and of course a lot of literature on women as activities, especially in parliament in Rwanda. But I haven't gotten a sense of what is the understanding of the ZANU-PF Women's League, its role after independence, and of course its role in the political violence since the year 2000. So Sisa Senkosi's work, in a sense, attempts to fill that gap where I said, well, this woman who, she was a teenager when she was a guerrilla, and her nickname is known as Spill Blood, right? So she has this, and she was one of two women in 1980 who was appointed as a minister, and she's been part of government since 1980. And somewhere in the title of this paper, the current working title of that thesis is called "I Was Nothing, I Was a Nobody," where when she leaves ZANU-PF and people ask her, "Why were you so quiet?" she says, "I was a nobody." So what does it mean for someone like Joyce Majuru with her political history, who has been part of this government from inception, to then say, "I was a nobody"? So that's what we're trying to make sense of. That's really the response I get. So I'm intrigued to see what Sisa Senkosi is going to find out. Right? And in terms of Thuli Madonsela, I'm currently reading Thandeka Gqubula's book on Madonsela. For me, I think in a sense, she was a surprise, and this is what is being argued in the book as well. And the ways in which then the beauty of a surprise is that she really has used the institution in the way that it ought to operate for women and everybody, And so she is an example of the kind of thing I think feminists are looking for, Madonsela, so maybe let me just sort of leave it at that. For Betty's question around, NDZ's silence, part of the thing is, so for this chapter, it's really evaluating her, when she was a Minister of Foreign Affairs, and in a sense, she's not quiet because quite clearly is on a campaign. So she is taking a position. She's doing something about what's the current upheaval. And the position might be that she sees herself as the person to redeem the ANC. Whether or not it can be redeemed is another question altogether, and what that will mean for her own legacy. So if the ANC, if she gets the presidency in 2010 and the ANC loses in 2019, will we find ourselves in a situation where, when we remember the death of the ANC, it is then pointed to her? These are some of the things that she has to reconcile with, if she is the last president of the ANC while it is in power, then we might find ourselves in a situation where someone again says, not another woman. Not because of her as a person, but in a sense, I'm also intrigued, why does she want it?
And it's also about what is the state and status of feminism or womanism or whatever you want to call it in Africa. With the Women's League, with women generally, with all of us at the moment.
At the moment, exactly. So
that is,
yes, and her campaign is awkward for feminists, right? Isn't that the truth? Also because of the person who's championing questioning her, right?
Yes.
All of a sudden, he's almost like he's a feminist, but he's not. He's not a feminist. He certainly isn't, you know. And so, in a sense,
And it's a dilemma because we are criticizing Western feminism. So what are we saying about African feminism, and which had a legacy of struggle
exactly.
and protest?
But for me, what it also shows is like these feminist critiques around, you know, so when women are invited to these questions of peace and security, the focus is around their role as women. But NDZ's personality shows us that none of us are just women.
Yeah.
We are women, we are middle class, others are poor, others are married to, we used to be, you know, married to powerful men, are also elite women on our own. And so in a sense, she shows why it cannot be that she can, you know, we can observe her purely as a woman. Because possibly, I mean, if other people are arguing that she may or may not be captured, part of the feminist reading is what does it mean to use the language of feminism when maybe one is covering looting, a possibility of continued looting, right? Which then brings us to Amina Mama's ideas of democracy and how women in government have manipulated feminism and the language of women's empowerment towards the ends of saving political parties that don't have feminist orientations. So this is what we also have to grapple with, you know, and is she making deliberate distinctions between herself, you know, between the legacy of this current administration, right, and what she and her leadership are going to bring to the country. I think part of that, she has to do that labor. You know, we cannot be left guessing in a sense. And the unfair part, indeed, is that then if the party collapses, even though quite clearly she's not the cause of its death, it may be the case that she'll be remembered as the leader under whom the party died. And then the first question around institution, add women and stay. Yes, because I saw you stepped out a bit. I mean, this is the core question, right? The failure of the language of transformation, which of course the reason why we moved to decolonization, because we realized it doesn't work. So Cheryl Hendricks a few weeks ago gave this fantastic inaugural lecture around the intersections of the language of peace, gender, peace and security, and the call to decolonize universities. Because like her, I also look at the conversations that happen, whether it's women in IR or women in the military or black people at universities, women at universities, they're sort of doing the same thing. So at universities, we're saying you can't just add blacks, add women and stay. The whole thing has to change. With militaries, we're saying you don't just add women as peacekeepers, as soldiers, the whole orientation has to change. So people like Heidi Hudson have argued that this is why gender mainstreaming has failed. Because in a sense, you just send women hoping to change the political, without actually changing the political culture of those institutions, whether in political parties or in institutions such as the UN, in militaries, in the police. I mean, you know, having Ria Piheja as the police commissioner when Marikana happened, it's a very traumatic thing for feminists, right?
Yes.
It's a glaring example of why that kind of gender mainstreaming or transformation is indeed not deep transformation. Because in a sense, is, you know, I mean, what happened? What happened? I mean, one of the other traumatic moments was, of course, General Mbombo, the one who authorized that, is someone whom, you know, we did a mini documentary celebrating women in the security sector, and General Mbombo was one of the people, and then she was one of those people who said, kill this thing, right? So if those deeper things don't change, to merely add women, obviously we're setting ourselves up to fail.
We've got 2 questions, 3 questions, but before I take them, I'm going to, because there's the issue that I'm burning to introduce, and I want to, even the people who are commenting might want to think about this. Gender equality is a constitutional prerogative. It's a non-derogable right. Yes, it is there because of the women's movement. Yes, it is there because of feminist struggle. but there's no demand in the Constitution that those women be feminists. It is a human rights issue, and that is purely and entirely what it is. So I think we need to distinguish that from what I call the feminist double standard, which is once a woman is in a position of power, we expect her to behave like a feminist. We don't ask that of the men who are in power, and so we impose a political double working day on women in power. And I just think we need to, as we discuss, we need to beware of applying that double standard to other women, because they may not be feminists, but we call ourselves. So why would we expect Ria Pieka to be any different from why? Has she claimed to be feminist?
We expect our men and our women to be feminists. We
Do
expect
we?
our men and leaders in government, because that's the full expression of our democracy that people died for.
Okay,
And
then I think
Nkoana-Mashabane has just died.
yeah, then I think we need to surface that then.
Yes.
Then we need to say, okay,
We're going to celebrate
Yeah.
Women's Day in a
but
few
but
weeks'
but then
time.
the whole question of what do women in power do becomes non-essential. Then that's not conceptually distinct from the question what do
They
men in
become
power
men.
do.
They become a masculine. They assume a masculinity.
Okay, there the room is boiling. I'm going to take, sorry, you were first, then Conita, then you, and then everybody who wants to ask a second round, we'll go round to you again. Okay, let's just take those three.
Yeah, actually, that was my question or comment.
Oh, then
Is
I'm
that,
an awful cheer. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. That we are looking now at the leadership styles of women, and we are saying they are honorary men. Should we be looking at their leadership styles, or should we be looking at the results of what they are trying to achieve and measure them according to what have they achieved, what we expect them to achieve? Because their leadership style, my leadership style will be different to the next person's, but is it delivering the results that we desire? That's the first thing. The second thing is, yes, I think it's you said it's the current minister, Maite, yes, that one of her achievements is that rape was included in the law of armed conflict. However, was it Maite?
No, it's actually part of the critique of South Africa leaving the ICC.
Oh, okay. But okay,
And
rape is now included, yes, there's the act, the Law of Armed Conflict Act. It's included there. However, it's still continuing. So, how does it help us to have an act that says that rape is an act of war if rape is still continuing? Number one. And interestingly, I'm in the military, so I agree with what you say, that it doesn't help to have women in the military if the mindset of the military doesn't change. And in fact, going back to the issue of the fact that we're looking at the leadership style of women, if that is the case, if we're saying they're honorary men, etc., then we should not be rejoicing at the fact that Africa has 9 out of 54 females. Because if we are not happy with their leadership style, why should we be happy with the fact that we've got 9? Because it means nothing in that case.
Yeah.
It means nothing. That's all from me.
So my question is more epistemological. Thank you very much for the paper. So if we have these women who are located in social worlds that are deeply inflicted by patronage systems and relationships that are entangled in ways that are deeply problematic, which we know the relationship, why is it that the view is only is similar to the big man or big woman of history rather than someone who is located within a tangled social world? Is there a value in widening the lens and not just to look at the movement within official and formal spaces? Because if the personal is the political, then to exclude the world in which the intimate worlds and the worlds in which many of these women operate is to reproduce an androcentric lens of a particular sort that says your public persona is your political life. And that's my.
Sure.
One more. Thank you, Kazi, for that paper and the way you're thinking about these things. I just find it very inspiring. It occurs to me, and I think some of the comments that have come through emphasizes that perhaps a task of African feminism is to reconfigure power. So how we think about power and what is power, it is still loaded with a masculinist notion of it. So if power and vulnerability, so I mean, you said, you know, the feminist definition of power is that it's relational. It's not only relational in terms of we depend on each other, but it's also relational to vulnerability. So vulnerability as the sort of balance to power, and the way power is operating at the moment is out of a fear of vulnerability. So it always increases vulnerability. So, you know, the big man and the big woman will be shedding anything that looks vulnerable because vulnerability is the dirty word. So I think an African feminist reconfiguration of that power is to embrace vulnerability as a very part of power that needs to be included in how we think. So to have a policy that says gender violence, what, or, you know, it's not going to change gender violence until we genuinely, in the other practices around gender violence, when you go and report it, when you go to the hospital, that these institutions also protect vulnerability instead of increasing the vulnerability. So it occurs to me that maybe there's some theoretical work to be done around how we conceptualize power and vulnerability, and which would have enormous impact then in the larger institutions like state and foreign policy on this continent.
Shall we take a response first and then let's get back?
Just to add to the power.
Okay. Sure.
Instead of
If it's linked to power.
Yeah. Power to be angry, power to change, power to make decisions, power to challenge. That's also the authority that our leaders have and assume. Members of parliament, whoever. And it's how do women claim that power when they're in those situations of power. So power not to dominate, but power to speak truth.
Thank you so much for the comments. And from the comment by Yvette's comment, I'm sort of thinking one of the things that Nica and myself have to think through actually. So I'm realizing we sort of underdeveloped the discussion around, so what is this vision of not only feminist leadership, but an African feminist leadership? So so I really appreciate that comment. What does it look like? And yes, so that then you can sort of then examine the extent to which these women leaders either measure or fail to meet that idea of an African feminist leadership. Style, leadership, yes. The point about style, it is important to. I think it is important because to say that there is only a kind of woman who can be a president. So if you look at Dlamini-Zuma, if you look at Angela Merkel, not so much Theresa May, somewhat Hillary Clinton. Basically says if for you to succeed you have to act in masculine ways, then a lot of women are not likely to be future presidents. Yeah. That's the issue with that. So if you have to act, so that's why the leadership style is connected to the results. You see, so it's not just a means to an end, because we don't flesh it out in the paper, but I think we need to develop the different perceptions of Dlamini-Zuma and Maite Nkoana-Mashabane. So one part, she's seen as a junior, but Mashabane also presents herself in more conventionally feminine ways, could one argue that this is why she's sort of not taken seriously? But of course, she also makes these bizarre pronouncements, which make it difficult to take her seriously, right? And she also, so that delicate balance between those things. Is there room to say that if she had a posture of seriousness that Dlamini-Zuma has, she would be taken more seriously and maybe be able to meet her goals because of that? And so what does it mean then if most women have to? I mean, could we imagine Angela Merkel behaving in a different way that she does as the president of the most powerful state in Europe? Could we imagine her wearing pink, doing all kinds of things? Is it a mistake that she looks the way she does? And so can we imagine a long-haired blonde woman in Germany becoming a future chancellor? Maybe not, right? So that's why it's important. So perhaps we need to develop that in a richer way, in a pointed way. So the point, of course, about the role of legislation is similar to, why do we have these domestic legislations that seek to address gender-based violence, when in South Africa, being a woman is an extreme sport. Mm-hmm. But for feminists, but the language, I mean, part of the feminist contribution to IR is to say war happens to people's bodies. It happens to people. It's not just dropping bombs. Those bombs are falling on people, and so they're not only falling on people, they are falling on gendered people, because when we talk about Yugoslavia, when we talk about the DRC, without the language of the role of gendered nature of violence, then we can't talk about women being raped in Congo. We can't talk about women being raped in Yugoslavia. We can't talk about the fact that the Rwanda genocide was gendered because Tutsi women were raped, as part of a weapon of war. So that's why that is important, that language, to even acknowledge it as a thing that exists, and then have ways to address it. So some of the practical changes is the inclusion of women's desks in places like Congo, in places like Sudan, where women can go and report being raped. Those are practical changes because of the shift in language. So I think they are important. And the critique by Carol Cohn and others to say, of course we applaud that the UN has acknowledged the role of women and gender more broadly at its highest level with UN 1325. But we must be careful that women are not invited in as, so because you are the one who gets raped, who's affected by war, then you must give us the solution to peace. We must be careful of that. As Yvette was saying, women must be part of peace building and peace resolution processes purely because we are humans, we are citizens as well, who should be able to discuss and negotiate the futures of their states. So this idea that you are there because you are most affected sets us up for failure. Because once we are there and we don't have this magical solution to peace, then it's like, why are you here? So then these rights, this argument that it can get taken away from you, which is part of the critiques of Dlamini-Zuma, that somehow she was supposed to solve the problems of the AU. I mean, that's laughable. The AU is in deep trouble. You certainly can't have one person, magically resolving its issues. And it's not a mistake that part of that critique somehow it's analysis, it's seen as her failure as a woman, and therefore failure of women in general. And then the last question, I think I sort of responded to your question, CK, around thinking about power and ideas around leadership. It's certainly something that we will have to develop further in this chapter. What does that, if people like, Zuki and others have argued that, power has changed in the 21st century, but if we take that closer to a feminist analysis, how do we understand the shifts in power in the context of a changing world? So I received that.
Thanks. Yeah, I think your idea of elaborating what particular African feminist theory you're using to evaluate these. Yeah, what is your measuring stick? You know, how are you? And if you get round to it, I would love to see, mainly because I haven't seen it, intersectional analysis of these theories. Because for me, you know, the perspective of somebody like Susan Boyson or Amanda Gous criticizing Dlamini-Zuma, there's very uncomfortable racial overtones around that. And the fact that it's done with a complete they don't seem to see that it's problematic to do that. And what kind of feminism is that? I think particularly in the case of Susan Boyson, I mean, at least I can say Amanda Gous was for 4 years a commissioner and has since piped down considerably about the comments she makes about the national gym, because she was actually forced to implement for a little while and she ran screaming from that. It's not safe yet. But so you know, even Shireen Hassim in some ways, when you look at the comments on the Fees Must Fall movement, you realize there's an element of class, even, and so to you know, so I would appreciate when you talk about these theories, maybe to have a bit of an intersectional approach to because I think it will help you develop your measuring stick. So that would be useful. I'm going to continue to take first round questions, and then hopefully we'll get to second round. So I saw you, 1, and Mimi, 2. Is there anybody else who hasn't asked a question who would like to? Okay, so we'll take those. Okay, no, then I'm going to do a third. Just check. 1, get to ask a question.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Kazi. I'm just thinking as you're speaking and the kind of sort of the links that you're making about Dlamini-Zuma, the work that she's done. And one of the fears that I have about this whole process is the amnesia that we have in this country and how many people, in fact, know that African Renaissance, not that it wasn't Tabo's idea, but it was also her idea as well. And so when we think about her contributions, we don't think of her as piggybacking on Tabo's ideas, but it was something, the work that she did as a student activist as well. And then this big moment that always seems to eclipse, because how many times have we all seen when we say, please can you stop calling her Zuma's ex-wife? She's actually just the title on she's Dr. Dlamini-Zuma. She's not Zuma's wife or Zuma's ex-wife or whatever the case is. And how that almost eclipses anything that she's done. And then now we have Ramaphosa, who also in amnesia that we have around him is very interesting, because we have the NUM moment, and then we have this new moment that he recreated for himself in business and Shanduka, and the women he has supported in creating positions for women through business. But his personal life doesn't even feature. So how many of us know that he's actually an abusive man? Whose children don't speak to him? That doesn't even come in, and how those then, if you talk about the personal is political, how that never even is going, and what are we going to remember when we look at those two people, and what are the ANC people going to remember come December when they look at these two people? And it's part of the trauma as well. And as you're talking about this, I'm like, oh my gosh, how many people know that this woman has actually done stuff? Not all on her own, but as a figurehead in this country. And now she's going to be in the running with this man that somehow has tucked his issues aside. And that trauma.
That was such a good comment. So I wanted to pick up on the comments, Siphokazi, that you made about democracy, and the women's ideal of democracy. I was wondering, can we because democracy is definitely within the nation state, right? But I'm wondering, can we begin to think about it in regional terms as well? And the reason I say this is because, at least from my perspective, South Africa has increasingly played a sub-imperial role under the Zuma administration. I can think of how it voted for the no-fly zone over Libya, thereby catalyzing the invasion of Libya and regime change, while every other African country voted against it. I can think about
Nigeria voted with them.
The
countries, the African countries in the Security Council voted for the resolution. They don't want us to remember that. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. And thinking about, how Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma came to be part of the AU chair, thereby violating the gentlewomen's agreement, that only small powers would take up that position. Or I can think about our incredibly Afrophobic home affairs policy, which really targets particularly women traders who are the drivers of regional integration and regional economic integration. So I'm wondering, to what extent then do these female figures then get co-opted into a kind of a, I don't want to use the word democracy, I think it's too strong, but into a kind of a sort of a sub-imperial agenda, and the way that the language of feminism is used to kind of negotiate and justify and cushion that.
Thank you. So, to add my very easy question to that, but I think you're thinking along very similar lines. If we are to call ourselves feminists, then I think we need to think also of these women as women. And the ANC as a patriarchal structure. And the only time in our historical moment that anybody spoke about it was the Kwezi trial. When she began to talk about what actually went on in the camps, the violence, the rapes, the murders, the detentions without trial, and the fact that our current president was in charge of ordering all of these. When Kwezi spoke about her own history, you saw this history of a woman that had been repeatedly violated by the very comrades for whom she dedicated her life. And then we never spoke about it again, except for Raymond Sackner, who's really, I'm sure you've read his book on patriarchy in the military, in the armed struggle, and how he relates that to. But so my predecessor, the CG, Gertrude Fester, she always used to say, well, where we should open up an office of the CG is at Parliament itself, because these women whom we expect to vote in laws against gender-based violence are themselves being so deeply violated on a daily basis. The only other time I can remember was, I forget her name, you know, whose husband beat her up with an iron because he gave her AIDS, and she ended up being promoted to ambassador to Namibia and then shut up. And that was the last time we had a debate about the patriarchy in the ANC. But how do you analyze these female figures without analyzing the history of violation from which they stem, and not to deduct from agency? I find them incredibly powerful women. But the fact is, in 2001, when we had to choose between proportional representation and constituency representation, we, the women's movement, supported proportional representation because it delivered the numbers. And what we've discovered since is it essentially handed state feminists over to the power of the patriarchy. Because the party then decides who's an MP and who's a minister, and not the constituency. The women report to the party patriarchy and not to us women. So we need to own that, and people like Rashida Shabodin, for instance, has often said that. She said, we voted for that. We, the ANC Women's League, I've never been ANC, but we, the civil society, women's movement, wanted the numbers so badly that we didn't give a thought to what are we doing to our sisters in state feminism. And so, like you say, we tend to forget about the history. But okay, what measuring stick are we using to judge these women by? And when we construct that measuring stick, what part of it looks at, Marx says man makes his own choices, but he doesn't choose the circumstance under. What part of it constructs those choices and those agency? And is there a way to look at that without sort of disempowering them and making them look like victims? So I'm like, kept you awake for the next 15 nights. But if you could pull it off, I think it would give us useful ways in which to talk about these women.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so such a beautiful point. And just to link it to Ata's comment, this is the difficulty. So one of the comments we received was, why in fact have the biographies in the chapter of Nkoana-Mashabane and Dlamini-Zuma? Because when the men write about Beki's foreign policy or Zuma, they don't talk about their personal histories, you see. So that's one thing so now we're trying to decide to motivate for having these biographies precisely because most people don't know that she was, they actually have this history. So one of the things immediately that come to our mind is that, well, you don't have to write that about Mbeki because everybody knows, you see. Whereas I'm not sure that a lot of people know that Mashabane was in the UDF. They don't know that history. NDZ is slightly more visible than she was, precisely also because she was in exile, you see. But not enough is known about her. So little is written about her for someone who's been part of government since 1994. So that's, so then we are caught up in this thing where we could then be accused of always then bringing in women's personal lives. Because then if you bring in that biography, then somewhere there you have to talk about who she was married to. And those perceptions about, is he championing her now as an ex-president because of their historical personal relations or because of her capacity as a leader? You see, whereas with him, you don't have to be dragged into that. So this is this constant choice that we are having to make. So for my PhD, I looked at the demobilization process of women combatants after '94, and really then getting into that, what happened in the camps, and what is it? That question around sexual violence, right? And of course, Satna has done the most extensive work on that, women in the underground and so forth. No, it's new, I just can't do it. So anyway, I'm hopefully working on a book project to build on, because Jacqueline Koch is still the only book that focuses on that history. So I had to grapple with those questions, because what I then found in the field with the women who were in MK, APLA women, is that a lot of them actually resist to answer those questions. Of course. But part of that, I think, is because the few times that women are invited to talk about their history in the armed struggle is when they talk about rape. Yeah. So often then what I found was that women actually, in the case where they would declare, it would be to say, I'm not a rape victim. Yeah. So there's this delicate thing that again we have to do where in that history, so we can talk about Zuma as exile history, we can talk about ANC as both as a liberation party and also as a party that also tortured its own members. When we talk about the tortures in Quadro, for example, we can handle all of that there, with all of the key, Jomodisa, Krisani, all of them are implicated in that. But somehow we don't do that with the women. We only talk about them as victims. So how does one hold that, historically and of course in the present, where then, in a sense, women want to say, indeed, even if I face those challenges, I am a leader, and so I accept that. I
think my concern was more around what is the political impact of that.
Yes, exactly, absolutely.
How does it dictate our national politics, and does that help us understand their function as female ministers? That was kind of my point. Yeah.
And in Zimbabwe, it's still the same. I mean, there was this discussion last year of whether or not Majuru was raped, as a guerrilla. So what then ends up happening is that conversation actually just doesn't happen. In which case then we are not able then to talk about the impact of women who are working, yes, in parliament, in the State House, with former comrades who also violated them. The idea that in Zimbabwe 40 years later, that conversation is yet really to happen. That it was only in that movie, Flash, that sort of provoked that conversation, and then it moved on. So that conversation in Zimbabwe and South Africa hasn't happened. And indeed, I mean, one of the things that attracts me to this conversation is that what Hendricks and Hudson and others have argued is that what we did with the call for the representation of women in these institutions is that we were focused on the numbers. So we sent women there, but we haven't actually asked how are they doing.
How are we supporting them?
How are we supporting them? So we talk about women, 68% of women in the Rwandese parliament. But is there really work that tells us how is it then to be one of those women in a country that is not democratic. That is highly militarized. What does it mean to presume to be doing feminist work under a dictator? So this is why, in a sense, this work moves us forward for the conversation around 30% quota and all of those things. But the comment you make about the fact that then it disempowered feminists from being able to support feminists within the state is actually quite crucial.
And it was our choice. We have to own it.
Yes. So then it applies, this idea of whether or not, what was the mandate? One of our speakers this week, Namfunda Ngwenya, is what was the motivating, what was the objective of sending Dlamini-Zuma to the AU?
Yeah.
What was South Africa's own agenda? Because what was their own agenda? Because indeed it is true that it is unheard of that a big state in Africa takes that position. It is the smaller states that usually have the chair of the AU. And of course it went, the vote went to the second round. She was not a clear winner. And so all kinds of alliances were disrupted because South Africa in a way forced itself, parachuted her, to the AU. To what end? What did she really, in a sense, she was, by the time she gets there, she's already alienated. She's alienated quite a number of allies, especially within Francophone, the assumed divisions between Francophone and Anglophone countries, and how did that then, in a sense, set her up for failure? I think I stopped there. Nimi's question around imperial agendas. In some ways, so now you're making me think that we have to dig. So South Africa votes for the intervention in Libya, but in a sense they're embarrassed about it. And I think now we have to sort of dig deeper in terms of it falling under Maite's term. What does that mean? But the issue is that there wasn't really a conversation around it. Other than sort of a sense of regret and the AU feeling as if they were overtaken by events. So. For instance, again, our visitor, Dr. Ngwenyes, made the argument that there were sort of these parallel processes where indeed Zuma goes to Libya to meet Gaddafi and say, work with these parties, trying to delay the intervention, but at the UN they vote for the intervention. So there's this puzzle of why would the ambassador at the UN vote yes when the country sort of maybe didn't want an intervention. But of course it's unthinkable that they could have voted a yes without the president or the minister not knowing, right? And so, what is this? But my reading is that a key feature of this administration is the lack of a need to explain its actions, and it's sort of reflected in Deco as well, and so the withdrawing from the ICC, all of those things sort of just happened, and there's a little need to explain things, and so we have to sort of guess for ourselves in a sense, but. So I don't have a sense of what she was thinking, what she made of the intervention. She's been more vocal on the ICC withdrawal more than South Africa's role in Libya. But of course, it's true that one has to be very careful on how you use Mama's concept of democracy, because it can have the impact. What is it? In a sense, the woman is always related to the man, And so, it's something to think through. But, in terms of the role of institutions and imperial agendas, it's precisely that women are women, but also women are also part of these political cultures. It took a long time. Yeah.
Second, third, fourth. There's one. Second and third questions, fourth questions. Only one. Okay, go ahead, dear.
Sorry, it just came up while you were speaking now, and I wonder if you could speak to what was NTZ doing at the AU? because the impression I got around that moment was that she was being sent there because she was a distraction for the second term Zuma. I think, unless I've read it wrong. Because if we then had her away, there was no way in which she could kind of be in the ANC. And so things would have to continue in that way. And so now she's coming back, and I'm interested to hear then what the cadres are going to say about her, because she's been away. There's this idea that she's been away, and what she's been doing away has got nothing to do with what we've been doing here. Right? So then, again, her career is then eclipsed all over again, because that's Africa. That's Africa. So, and obviously South Africa's tension with the AU and how they see what happens at the AU relating to what we do here.
This is true. This is true. So for me, there's sort of a dilemma with that question, because for me, it makes sense that she was sent to the AU. So if one sort of understands this idea that, to be seen as a legitimate candidate for a president, you need liberation credentials. But mainly in the US, you need to usually show that you have a military record, or a record of having been overseas, in a sense. So Obama becomes the first president without a military record. And so if you use that frame, I'm thinking, for me it makes sense where we say, so if Enlo argues that part of the problem why women are not in IR is because travel, the act of travel itself is gendered. So masculinity is the passport to travel. So when they say, oh, will she, click the button at 3 a.m. or 2 a.m. in the White House, what is her relationship to danger? So when the offer by Obama, for me, to Clinton, the post of the Secretary of State, was not a mistake. It was a way to prepare her, to make her seen more legitimate as a future president, that I'm able to deal in the world. I have traveled, I have dealt with heads of states and all of that, And so for me, it was not a surprise that then she calls her book Hard Choices, the reflection on her years as a Secretary of State, that as a woman, I am able, under conditions of war, to make hard choices. So for me, moving her, from foreign affairs to the AU, it gave her even more points. Not only can I run South Africa, I have run the continent. But whether or not she did is another question altogether. So in terms of the trajectory to the presidency, for me that makes sense. But this point you are raising around, maybe, of course, it was to delay, in a sense, not to delay. The question of her stature, her candidacy, would have come up sooner had she stayed in the country is actually quite valuable. So think about that. Whew.
Thank you. Okay, lunch. I'm also unfortunately going back to Cape Town at 2, so thank you all. It's been